If we continue looking at Africa and European imperialism there, one of the examples we want to take a little bit better note of is the Congo Free State in the late 19th century, there between 1885 and 1908. In this area, which is in the map there, it says the Belgian Congo in the center. This is the area controlled by Leopold II. Bear in mind that it was a personal possession of Leopold's. It was not something that belonged to the Belgians themselves. And in fact, he used explorers, the International African Association, and the Berlin Conference, as we saw, to make inroads into the Congo, which basically was given to him as an individual to oversee, like a business, not a formal colony. It consisted of 30 million people who had no say in who was in charge of them, and he also personally had never been there. So he split the area into a number of regions and then gave all these different administrative posts in those regions to Europeans. Now, what took place actually in the Belgian Congo? Well, he extracted raw goods from the Belgian Congo, especially ivory and rubber. Because there's no constitution there, there's no international oversight, he was able to essentially subject the people to slavery, even though it violated many of the things that have been stated in the other conferences. He used mass killings, maimings, and other human rights violations to get labor. Any vacant land, when vacant by his definition was land not used by a European, was considered property of the state and would be distributed to loyal bureaucrats. The African natives themselves could only sell their goods to the state, to his men, rather than selling directly to other countries. And they were also forced to provide fixed quotas of rubber and ivory to give at least 10% of their population over to Leopold as full-time workers, to present another 25% as part-time laborers, and to provide food for the bureaucrats. Now, two of the main things then that come out of here are ivory and rubber. Ivory, of course, comes from the elephants, but rubber comes from vines and from rubber trees. And the way that it was harvested was that you would slash the vines in order to get the rubber itself out, the latex. The problem is that there weren't a lot of places to actually dry the rubber. And rather than build any sort of drying racks, Leopold and his workers, the bureaucrats, decided that they would just simply use the labor of the individuals living in the Congo themselves, the Africans who were there. And by use their labor, I mean actually use their bodies. They would use their bodies to lather their bodies with the rubber that came out of the vines until it dried, and then when it was dried, they'd rip it off. So they used humans as drying racks. This is a painful process. It obviously pulled off hair and possibly skin too. So it's kind of an indication of just how bad it was in the Belgian Congo that you would simply just line people up and cover them with the rubber from the rubber trees and just tear it off their bodies. Leopold's personal profit here at this time was in the tens of millions of dollars at a time when 1 million was a sizable fortune. So what were the results there? Well, these rubber quotas that they needed were enforced by a public police force that was called the Force Publique, which you see there, consisting of Europeans, and the Europeans themselves had found fierce cannibals who had been captured in the territory and conscripted into the force. The idea was that these Europeans and the cannibals were trained to use the most brutal techniques by terrorizing the population, by looting, pillaging, raping, killing. There were reports, they would use the cannibals to strike fear into the other Africans, but there were reports of widespread cannibalism in the Belgian Congo, even among the Europeans themselves. The estimates of the death toll range between 3 and 23 million, so even the low end of 3 million is incredibly high, but 23 million is an unconscionable amount of people who died during this period. Because the Force Publique they were required to prove that they hadn't wasted any bullets when they were hunting people down, they had to submit a human hand for every bullet that was used. And in fact, what happens there is that human hands actually become a form of currency. If you look at this quote here from one of your readings, what you find is this here. It says, "The baskets of severed hands set down at the feet of the European post commanders became the symbol of the Congo Free State. The collection of hands became an end in itself. Force publique soldiers brought them to the stations in place of rubber. They even went out to harvest them instead of rubber. They became a sort of currency. They came to be used to make up for shortfalls in rubber quotas, to replace the people who were demanded for the forced labor gangs, and the force publique soldiers were paid their bonuses on the basis of how many hands they had collected. What this means is that what had started off as a way just to mark how many bullets they used ended up being uh, uh, the way in which the Belgian Congo was actually run. That is, they wouldn't even use bullets anymore. They would just terrorize people. They once severed hands became a form of commerce there and became an actual form of money. They would just seek them out. Here is a picture taken in the Belgian Congo of Africans who are surrounded by Europeans there, who are each holding a severed hand from someone who, whether this was done in terms of terrorizing them or simply for the currency, but the idea is to show just how insane the Belgian Congo became under Leopold's control. By around 1900, the story of this began to be exposed in the US and European press, thanks in part to Conrad's Heart of Darkness book. An investigation was held, and although Leopold agreed to change his ways, not many took him seriously. And while people debated who should take over the Belgian Congo, Leopold went back to work and attempted to milk as much as possible out of the area. It finally took until 1908 before Belgium finally agreed to take the Congo from the king and make it a formal colony overseen by the government. But obviously, in its wake, you have millions of people who are brutally murdered during this period of Belgian control just simply to get ivory and rubber. All right, as another example, we're going to look here, Europeans in Asia. We'll start with the British in India itself. Bear in mind that Britain had a presence in India since the beginning of the early 17th century with the English East India Company, so they had set up trading posts. But the Indian government was really strong at that time, and so they really had nothing more than outposts for quite a long time. And they were owned by the trading company and really had nothing to do with the English crown. By 1690, though, by the late 17th century, the Indian government began to go into decline, and the English company began to expand its presence, often getting involved in local disputes that ended up benefiting the company. The British government, realized that in order to protect its economic interests, the company needed to have a military and a bureaucracy, and so it granted them these things in 1765. After this point, although the company was still technically working independently, in essence it became an arm of the crown. They began to conquer region after region using Indian soldiers that joined the company's army. So bear that in mind as the way in which it sort of starts off with India. How did they control this? Well, in terms of the economics, the British actually damaged the Indian cloth market significantly because they forced the Indians, to buy British textiles, and they barred Indian textiles from British markets. The idea was to benefit the British. They changed the landowning practices, and they made the now subject peoples grow new crops that would benefit British trade and industrialism, particularly opium, which the British grew in order to sell to China. Uh, and so that's one major impact. They forced them to change their land practices, their trade, their crops. In terms of their relationship with Indians themselves, with Indian troops, part of the problem that they ran into when they were using Indian soldiers for the company's army was that a lot of Indians themselves were dissatisfied with British political and economic interference. And even social interference, obviously. The idea that they were trying to change Indian culture and make it more sort of European. But the final straw that actually led to a massive rebellion in 1857 was there was a rumor going around that the British that the cartridges that were used for the rifles that the Indian troops used were greased with both pig and cow fat. Well, since the troops themselves were mixed up of both Muslims and Hindus, this was offensive to both. Hindus revered the cow as sacred, and so having its fat in the rifle cartridges was sacrilegious. Likewise, for the Muslims who saw pigs as unclean, having pig and cow fat or pig fat in the cartridges was sacrilegious as well. So that was just sort of the last straw. This mutiny spread across the country, resulted in significant loss of life in India. Ultimately, what had happened is that in India was that it ultimately they pushed for independence, but it didn't happen until 1947. That was after the British had actually made it a full part of the British Empire, and Queen Victoria became the Empress of India in 1877. So it takes until 1947 for them to gain independence. All right, if we look to British China, for example, what we see there is that throughout a lot of Chinese history, China had been actually closed off to foreigners because the Chinese saw the foreigners as inferior, especially the Europeans, who they considered to be barbarians. During the Napoleonic Wars, the British had tried to forge diplomatic ties with China. They sent a fleet there with gifts for the emperor, had the latest European technology and art, but they received a letter back saying the Chinese were unimpressed with European achievements, but they were welcome to come pay homage to the Chinese emperor at his court. Even when trade was finally allowed, it was really, really restricted, and so what happened is that the British were only allowed to use certain ports because the Chinese wanted to reduce foreign influence on their country. There were high custom duties, and basically China was, self-sufficient, didn't need European goods. The British themselves, if they wanted silk, porcelain, or tea, they had to pay in silver, and so it became really expensive for them. The only thing that they found that the Chinese really wanted was opium, and they could grow that in India, their other colony. That trade was illegal, but it was extremely profitable. And the British pushed this so much that by the end of the 19th century, 1 out of 10 Chinese was an opium addict. Because 75% of the population were children, this left a huge burden on non-addict adults who had to provide for the entire nation. There was 2 extreme famines that led to widespread misery, even cannibalism. And so what happens here is that the Chinese actually tried to end the opium trade. This provokes the first opium war with Britain. They had a much larger army, but by this time it wasn't as technologically advanced, plus you have the problem with the opium. The peace terms forced China to pay reparations to Britain, opened Chinese ports to trade with Europe, gave the island of Hong Kong to Britain as well. A lot of Chinese were angry, and this led to rebellions against the Chinese dynasty, but a lot of Europeans thought the treaty didn't go far enough. When the British tried to renegotiate the treaty, this led to another opium war in the 1850s. The British won again. They gained access to all of China's rivers. Actually, they even demanded, in a very imperialist fashion, that all Chinese documents be written in English. One of the things that comes out of this period of imperialism in China, and in fact that shows you that the British and others were definitely, and particularly Europeans, are definitely involved in causing problems there, was that the Europeans continued to interfere in Chinese politics and economics until 1911, with a revolution that led to the establishment of the Chinese Republic. And what you see is that imperialism really sort of laid out for you in this image here, where you have a whole series of Europeans and someone from Japan as well, who look to be dividing China up as if it's sort of a pie here. You have Queen Elizabeth there, you have the German Kaiser. Notice the 2 of them are very much into competition with one another, carving it up. You have the Russian Tsar as well, sort of looking on because he borders that. That's Marianne, the representation of France, behind him there that you can see. You also have a Japanese, potentially samurai, there as well, representing Japan. He doesn't have a knife out, but he does have that knife on the table there. And then behind them, you have a very, very stereotypical image of a Chinese person with stereotypical dress and facial hair on him, who obviously is displeased with what's going on in China. One of the best ways then to interpret this image is that Europeans really have no regard for the people they come into contact with in terms of their imperialism, and they are simply dividing China up as they see fit with no input or say at all by the Chinese themselves. Not in this case, it doesn't seem to be so much about them seeing themselves as superior so that they can improve the Chinese culturally. Here, it's much more about economics as well. In places like India and parts of Indochina, for example, though, the irony of this imperialist approach to westernize people, to make them follow along British or European standards, the case of both Mohandas Gandhi and Ho Chi Minh. Both of them were educated in the West. They were exposed to nationalist independence movements and Enlightenment ideas, and both of them came back to their respective countries, India and Indochina, later Vietnam, and pushed for independence, and were successful in independence.